Today's event is dedicated to discussing Orit Avishai's new book, Queer Judaism, LGBT Activism, and the Remaking of Jewish Orthodoxy in Israel. The book represents years of fieldwork, interviews, and research that Orit conducted with members of the Orthodox LGBT community in Israel, and driven by her interest as a sociologist of religion in questions of religious practice, communal belonging, gender, and sexuality. It explores an important and timely topic relevant not only in Israel, but also here in the United States and elsewhere as Orthodox Jewish communities grapple with the issue of LGBTQ belonging in synagogues, universities, and other denominational institutions. Here in the US, the issue has emerged both on a grassroots level and also from institutional leaders in halachic, ethical, and even legal realms, some advocating for inclusion and acceptance, and others laying down firm boundaries of exclusion. The book also speaks more generally to LGBTQ activism within religious communities, especially communities that have historically been reluctant or opposed to accept LGBTQ members and issues. So I want to congratulate Orit on this wonderful new book. These are difficult days, and it's not easy to celebrate a professional accomplishment in such a context. So thank you, Orit, for sharing your work with us, especially now when learning together and exploring complicated topics is more important than ever. I'm looking forward to learning both from you and from Brett this evening. And I'm grateful that Brett Krutzsch has agreed to be in conversation with Orit and her work this evening. Brett will introduce Orit and offer a few words about her book, and so I'd like to introduce Brett. Brett is the Assistant Director of New York University's Center for Religion and Media and editor of its award-winning online magazine about religion and society, The Revealer. Dr. Krutzsch is a scholar of religion, sexuality, and LGBTQ politics in the United States. He's the author of the book, Dying to Be Normal, Gay Martyrs and a Transformation of American Sexual Politics, a 2020 Lambda Literary Award finalist for the Non-Fiction Book of the Year. A recipient of the Virginia Rami Mollenkott LGBTQ Religious History Award, he is the editor with Nora Rubel of the forthcoming anthology, Blessings Beyond the Binary, Transparent and the Queer Jewish Family, coming out from Rutgers University Press in 2024. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, The Advocate, and the New York Times. So welcome, and thank you both, Brett and Orit, for sharing your work and insights with us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to celebrate the launch of this excellent book. Let me give you a brief overview of how the evening will, or how the event will unfold this evening. So after I offer a few brief remarks about the book, the author, Orit, is going to share a short overview of the book so that all of us, regardless of our knowledge of Orthodox LGBT activism or our background, will have a shared sense of what the book covers before we start our conversation. After that, she and I are going to discuss the book and queer Orthodox Jews in Israel, and then we're going to open it up to all of you for an audience Q&A for any questions you might have about Orit's work. Let me first, though, begin by introducing the author of Queer Judaism, so you have a sense of some of what she brings to this topic. Orit Avishai is professor of sociology here at Fordham. She holds a PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley and law degrees from Tel Aviv University and Yale Law School. Her scholarship reflects this broad training. She clerked in the Israeli Supreme Court and worked briefly as a lawyer. She has written about breastfeeding and the politics of motherhood in the United States, Israeli Jewish Orthodoxy, women and conservative religions, and the marriage education movement in the United States. Her new research focuses on conceptions of religious freedom in American Jewish Orthodox communities. Her newest book, The Reason We're All Here, is Queer Judaism, LGBT Activism, and the Remaking of Jewish Orthodoxy in Israel. Before I invite Orit to speak, let me share a few brief remarks about the book that I think will be of interest both to scholars and really anyone with an interest in this topic. So that now includes everyone in this room. And I'd like to highlight two things in particular that I find especially noteworthy about this book. Let me just briefly preface this by saying I have read many books about queer people and religion, from books on queer Mormons and queer Methodists and queer Muslims, and those from religious communities that don't start with the letter M. But here's the thing. Much of this fine scholarship on queer people within religious communities talks about how queer people have tried to reconcile their queer identity with their religious identity, or how they negotiate. Those are the two key buzzwords: reconcile and negotiate. How they negotiate being queer with being religious, as if they are opposing forces always in conflict. So it's sort of like you'll be reading an article or a book about gay Mormons, for example, and they'll describe them as, I'm gay and I'm Mormon, and if I don't do some things from this identity, and I don't do some things from this identity, I can kind of sort of contort the puzzle pieces to sometimes fit together. But in her new book, Orit Avishai breaks out of that framework and offers a new vision to think about queer religious people, one that I think will offer helpful insights to anyone interested in better understanding conservative religious communities and queer religious people. Through her deeply researched and incisive ethnography, Avishai shows how, rather than reconciling two seemingly incompatible identities, queer Orthodox Jews in Israel actually, in her words, quote, produced new Orthodox identities. In other words, Avishai shows us how the people she studied don't see Orthodox and queer as incompatible entities that need to be reconciled. They see them as congruent, as two things that simply exist simultaneously. And by seeing them as compatible, as something that shouldn't maybe even be that remarkable, Avishai tells us that they are changing Orthodox Judaism itself. So this new analytical lens changes the questions that we ask now going forward. So rather than asking, how are LGBT Orthodox Jews changing themselves to try to fit into Orthodoxy, she shows us that we should be asking, how is Orthodoxy changing because LGBT Orthodox Jews exist? So as the subtitle of the book makes clear, they are remaking Orthodoxy in Israel, even as many of them do not see themselves as radicals. And that brings me to the second point the second insight from the book that I want to bring up. What I am now going to be calling the politics of being boring, or what we might call the queer potential of the mundane. Most of the people you meet in this book are not striving to make things like polyamory palatable or fetishes fashionable. They do not want to burn down the Orthodox house and build a new with different materials of leather, lace, and latex. Rather, they want to stay in the house they already know with just a little alteration. They want a room to partner with someone of the same gender, with another person they can spend Shabbat and holidays with, do the laundry with, plot some plans together, fix the bathroom when it leaks, and do all of the other banalities of life. But here's the thing about what I'm now calling the politics of being boring that is quite prevalent in Avishai's book. What seems like a boring life to some is for some other Orthodox Jews in Israel a radical, mind-blowing, fire alarm-pulling crisis. To some, the very idea of a queer Orthodox Jew incites great anxiety about the future of Orthodox Judaism. And as Avishai makes clear in his book, that may in fact be what is at stake here, the very future of Orthodoxy itself in Israel. So we have many exciting things to discuss. Before she and I delve into our conversation, we thought it would be helpful for everyone in the audience to get an overview of what the book covers. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished author, Orit Avishai.
Thank you. Wow, Brett, I should have consulted you when I had the manuscript. Those metaphors were so much better than the ones I have. He was not quoting from me, let me tell you. Okay, so as you've heard, queer Judaism is based on several, actually many, years of research with a proud religious community in Israel, Kadag or Kihilat in Hebrew. This is a loose network of organizations and individuals who identify as gay, lesbian, queer, or LGBTQ+. And I'll be using the terms interchangeably, kind of reflecting what's going on in the field, and are Orthodox Jews. And when I say Orthodox Jews, this is the US equivalent of modern Orthodox. So people from Orthodox backgrounds, not Haredi, so not ultra-Orthodox. And for my purposes, this also includes people who grew up in Orthodox homes and either disaffiliated or kind of are on some kind of range there. My main focus has been on same-sex attracted for reasons I can explain later. And during my many years of research, I interviewed several dozen Orthodox LGBTQ persons, activists, family members, allies, and rabbis. I observed in physical and online spaces where they come together to worship, advise one another, study, socialize, and of course, advocate for their rights to be present in Orthodox spaces. The departure point for this book was this puzzle. Until fairly recently, and by that I mean the early 2000s, mid 2000s, Jewish people, Orthodox Jewish people in Israel could not imagine embracing their LGBTQ identity and staying with the Orthodox fold. So just what Brett described, right, that was the reality. But within a span of a decade and change, maybe definitely a decade and a half, they created all these social spaces and communities and articulated individual and communal identities of both and. So my book asks, well, what are the implications for queer individuals, for their families, for their communities, for Jewish leadership, for Jewish theology, and as Brett talked about at the end there, for the very idea of being an Orthodox or observant Jew. So the book is organized around three questions or themes. The first is the lived experience. What does it feel? What does it mean to be Orthodox and queer? And Brett talked about this. What is that? Oh, it's the sorry. Okay, now we know. Okay. So in the popular imagination, religious queer seems like an oxymoron. And when I would tell people about my research, they would like rough it up. They're like, well, it's impossible to be. And I would be like, well, how do you know? Like, what but what drives these perceptions is this idea that there's something inherently contradictory, and this cuts across religious traditions. And, many religious traditions, Orthodox Judaism included, don't have a very good track record when it comes to queer lives, right? So people have been subject to silencing, excommunication, outing, shame, conversion therapy. So there is some reason to that. And my book did document some of how Orthodoxy's social structures, institutions, politics, and culture create hardships for queer Orthodox persons. But, and this is the uplifting part, the book also documents how they not only struggled with the tradition, but worked within it and harnessed its own sensibilities, language, theologies to create something from anew, something threatening. I'll come back to that in a second. So this is the first theme. The second theme is about the activism, where I looked, well, how did this happen? How did they create new meanings, new identities, new possibilities? So 20 years ago, Rabbi Shlomo Avimer, who's a very conservative Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and I'm using conservative here as an adjective, small c, not a denomination, announced, quote, "There is no such thing as a religious homosexual." And in the early 2000s, he was nominally right, because there was no visibility. People either left Orthodoxy or just sort of lived their lives under the radar. Fast forward to October 2020, and a leading rabbi associated with more progressive wing of Orthodoxy, Dr. Rabbi Benny Lau, issued theological halachic guidelines intended to help some, not all, but some observant queer Jews, so those in same-sex, monogamous, long-term relationships, manage their family lives in accordance with Jewish customs and laws, or the halacha. That was a theological and political earthquake within Orthodox communities. So for the first time, there was this recognition. This was a product of very long 15 years of activism, a lot of it behind the scenes, a lot of it under the radar, where the Orthodox, the proud religious community talked with rabbis, right, as part of their queer activism. But they also invoked all sorts of traditional methods of activism, including protest, including visibility campaigns, educational campaigns, and just living boring lives. I realized like all these new people that I met, they immediately friended me on Facebook, and I realized, wow, all these pictures of kids crying at their birthday party, that was sort of activism too. So that's sort of the politics of the mundane, right? Or something, yeah. So as you can imagine, and already talked about this, conservative Orthodoxy was not very pleased with these developments, neither with the guidelines and with the increased visibility, because this represented acceptance and near normalization of queer presence in the Orthodox community. And this is the third theme in the book then. I didn't know this when I started the research, but what I realized sort of as I was analyzing the material and then when I wrote the book, that these debates of whether one can be were actually debates about the legitimate boundaries of authentic Orthodox Judaism. And my original subtitle was The Battle for Orthodoxy's Straight Soul, which a friend actually suggested, and I thought like captured my main argument, but the press wouldn't let me use it. But in my mind, that was sort of the essential gist of the argument, right? So who can be in, who's out, how far can you stretch tradition, and who has the authority to decide who's in and who's out. So for a long time, these debates about who can be Orthodox Jew were largely intra-sectorial, right, within the Orthodox community. And increasingly, Orthodox conservative have recast Orthodox LGBT persons as undermining the very Jewish character of the state. So not just threatening Orthodoxy, not just threatening Judaism, but threatening the character of the state. And for those who follow Israeli politics, between 2019 and 2022, there were 5 rounds of elections, and with each election, more and more sort of extremists, sort of religious extremists, were kind of brought into the mix until we got the current government. And what we were seeing is this rise of a blatant mix of religious, xenophobic, ultranationalist, homophobic, transphobic, sexist ideologies that kind of all converged together. So I've avoided this term purposefully thus far, but many of you might know that in Hebrew, Orthodox is actually used interchangeably with religious, nationalist, Zionist to refer to a group that's not just a religious group, but also this is also an identity label, a political category, and a political label. So this is the final point I want to make in the introduction, although then I have a couple of snippets I want to introduce you to a couple of people from my research. So what this implied, right, that this divergence on questions of gender and sexuality the rhetoric that the proud religious community used to make their case for belonging in the Orthodox community was not just that we are like you, it was, or it is, we are of you. We are part of this community. So if this community is not just Orthodox, but also Zionist, religious, nationalist, that was part of the mix. And this is a little bit of a paradox, right? For progressives, for queer activists worldwide, because how can you be invested in tearing down one kind of oppressive regime, right? A religious, sexist, well, also sexist, but it's transphobic, homophobic regime, while also upholding a national and interreligious oppressive regime. And this is also part of the story. And I'm sure some of that will come up. So I want to introduce you, before we get into the Q&A, just to two people I met during my research, just to give this a little bit of a flavor from the ethnography. So the first of them is Ayelet, who I met in 2017. And she was mourning the, quote, picture of what life was supposed to look like. She was closeted in her late 20s and occasionally dated men. She said that she hoped that she would be able to marry a man and have, quote, a real wedding with a huppah, that's a wedding canopy, and a shattered glass, which is part of the Jewish wedding ceremony, rather than shattered dreams. Ayelet said that she knew from a young age that something was, quote, wrong with her, that she was, quote, different. She said friends would endlessly talk about boys, and all she could think about was her female teachers and movement counselors. And she kept all this in secret and, quote, prayed for this to change. I caught up with her a couple of years later. She was still closeted, celibate, and she said she was stuck. Everyone around her was not married, had children, friends and family stopped trying to set her up with eligible men, which was a relief. But she felt like she was very, very lonely. Her friends ended up settling in a neighborhood, Orthodox neighborhood, very much like the one where she grew up, but she felt she had no place there as a single woman, and she couldn't imagine being there as part of a same-sex couple. And again, this is in the late 2010s. But then she said she was stuck mainly because she could not imagine living a life with another woman. And she made lifelong messages for family, teachers, rabbis, all of that meant to be. A couple of years ago, I came across her on Facebook, as one does, and she was in a relationship, and I don't know, as far as you can tell from Facebook and social media, it tells us the truth, right? She seemed content. Benny realized that he was gay in his early adolescence. At his bar mitzvah, he felt like a hypocrite, he said, because he knew he was never going to be able to fully realize Jewish male adulthood, which for him included not just for him, this is sort of the method, a real Jewish home with a wife and children. One of the first calls he played when he got a cell phone was to a conversion therapy organization. His contact there told him that it was possible to change and assured him that he would change, but there was time not to worry. He was still young. And this is a story that repeated over and over, especially with the men. In the meantime, he kept having crushes, a best friend, a classmate, a youth group counselor. At some point, he contacted an Orthodox therapist who was rumored to help men in a situation. In hindsight, he realized that this was conversion therapy, but something felt wrong. He didn't pursue it. Other people did. But that led to a crisis of faith because he was referred to this therapist by his rabbi. And again, this came up over and over. And then it became urgent because his friends and younger siblings, there's the whole sibling thing, and his younger siblings were getting married and having children, and he was still, he was single. And his whole life plan had imploded because he planned to go back to the settlement where he had grown up in the West Bank, Orthodox settlement. There was no way he was going to be able to, and he's a teacher, he was not going to live there. So I crossed paths with him a few years later, actually several times. And by then he was in a monogamous relationship with an ex-Orthodox man, and they were considering starting a family. And then a couple of years later, they did have a child via surrogate. And they were planning to send their kids to Orthodox schools, and what would have seemed like complete farcical kind of sort of illusion, like just a few years ago, was like becoming a reality by the early 2020s. So I'll stop there, but like these two stories that tell and many others kind of they capture key way stations in the lives of same-sex attracted Orthodox Jews. This idea of a shattered life plan, a chaotic aftermath, but then from there emerges a new life plan that entails a reimagining, or what I call a rescripting, of what means to be Orthodox, which is then viewed as threatening to Orthodox conservatives. I don't know. Is this okay? Are you? Oh,
Need to shift camera to you guys, and I don't know where the camera is.
okay.
We'll wait until.
The other one.
No, go back.
Oh, sorry.
Almost.
Almost.
A little up, and a little bit back. Okay, but you know, yeah.
Perfect. Good, right there.
Thank you. They don't train us for that when you get a PhD. So, let's continue with you. So, I think maybe a good place to start, and you sort of touched on this, but what led you to be interested in wanting to spend years studying LGBT Orthodox Jews in Israel? And then, in addition to that, what, beyond your own personal or academic interests, what made you feel like this is something that, you know, needs to be examined now?
So there are several origin stories. The first one is Fordham students, actually. So I had my previous work was on Orthodox Jewish gender and sexual regimes, but in the heterosexual context. And I had done a lot of work on Orthodox Judaism in that context. And I had been teaching courses on gender and sexuality at Fordham at a time when we were still a women's studies department. And I have a lot of colleagues here who helped change the name of the department and to get queer theory that was on the books. But when you teach these kinds of courses, you get a lot of students. Oh, hold on. Is it okay? Up. It's not on.
Oh, there you go.
Now?
No, doesn't work.
Must be dead.
We can switch.
Okay.
Yep.
Should I start over? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, I can't. Now you can check my versions. So how did I get started this? So I had been a scholar of Orthodox Judaism for a while, 10 years. But my previous work had been on Orthodox Jewish gender sexual regimes as they pertain to heterosexual couples. And I also taught gender courses at Fordham University. It's less so now. I mean, our student body is still very Catholic, but less so. But in the early 2010s, it was still predominantly Catholic. And when you teach gender sexuality courses at a Catholic university, and where at the time there were not a lot of courses on gender sexuality, you get students who are interested in the subject matter in part because of their own journeys. So I got curious. I was teaching this material kind of academically. I was getting students in my classes. I had a dear colleague who has left us in the theology department, Patrick Hornbeck, who was interested in these questions from a theological, intellectual perspective. And a sabbatical came up and kind of it all converged. I was a little naive when I started. I don't know that I would have done it by kind of given some thought. So I should have said this earlier, but I will say it now. I'm an outsider in all the different ways to the community that I studied. I'm as far away from Orthodox that you can imagine. And I do not identify as LGBTQ. I'm cisgender. I have been married to a man for many years. So cisgender. So I was an outsider to the community, but I came in with an sort of intellectual interest, and I sort of this ethic of care that emerged from what I was hearing from students, and then as I delved into scholarship. So it's kind of two origin stories, I guess. Oh, yes.
Thank you. It's gonna make our duet at the end of the program that much harder. Before we delve into some specifics in your book, I think maybe some context for a room of New Yorkers will be helpful. How would you describe the place of Orthodoxy within Israel broadly? And then I think from your opening remarks, it sounds like there's been a lot of rapid change for queer people, for queer Orthodox Jews in Israel, but sort of what's the Orthodoxy in Israel, and then also the place of sort of queer people in Israel?
So Orthodoxy in Israel, it's one of those things that like you think you know it when you see it, but you don't really. So surveys differ, but the population I'm talking about is around 20% of the Jewish Israeli population. And it's hard to pinpoint because it really depends on the kinds of on definitions, right? But so it's around 20%. And by the way, I had no definition. If you identified as Orthodox in the local context, that was good enough for me. And again, this does not include the ultra Orthodox, right? This is just the Orthodox community. And one of the important characteristics of this community, or this sort of significant demographic chunk of Israeli society, is that they have been on the rise, both numerically, but also in terms of sort of cultural significance. And definitely in the past couple of decades, really achieving like leadership positions in all major institutions, right? I mean, including the previous Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, that was modern Orthodox, or Orthodox in the sense that I'm talking about. The military is a central institution, so they're high to everything, right? So really gaining prominent education. So that's one thing. The other thing about the Orthodox community in the past couple of decades, and we both alluded to it in our remarks, as it's grown, as its prominence has grown of this sort of demographic category, there have been a lot of internal tensions, right? So yeah, you speak of Orthodoxy, but then there's like the Rabbi Lau and the Rabbi Avinel. I mean, they're very different animals, right? So there's a lot of research about sort of intrasectorial tensions and the sort of tribalism from within. It's collapsing from within. Who knows what will happen at the other end of what we're seeing now between the protest movement of the past year and the war. That's reshuffling everything. So that's one. In terms of queer or LGBTQ, so the 1990s is kind of known as Israel's gay decade, except that it started in like 1988 and it went through, 2001, depending who's counting. But the point is that something huge happened in the late 1990s in terms of both cultural visibility and a huge rights movement. Mainly ushered in by the Supreme Court, a very activist, progressive Supreme Court, but also aided by some legislative action, etc. So, but as in many other places, like sort of the gay decade and the huge victories for gay rights in that decade were not evenly distributed, right? So it was as everywhere else, it was mostly for cisgender, gays and lesbians, urban, and Jewish, not religious, right? So when we get to the end of the gay decade, right? So late 1990s, other groups are realizing that they've kind of been left behind.
Yeah. So, okay, so in your book, you describe a range of responses from straight Orthodox people and leaders and the movements they run. And as you mentioned, one group you labeled the Orthodox conservatives. And you say in the book that for some Orthodox conservatives, the presence or the possible inclusion of LGBT Orthodox Jews presents an existential threat, right? So it's not just that they're opposed to this, they're concerned that the whole thing could unravel. So what is it about LGBT Orthodox Jews in particular that produces that anxiety that they see it at a level of an existential threat?
Let me give a couple of examples of this. And it's terrifying actually to even articulate this now. Repeatedly, chief rabbis, that is an official position in Israel. Israel has a state, well, not one, two, because one is Ashkenazi and one is Mizrahi or Sephardi. But so a chief rabbi who basically calls LGBTQ people terrorists and tells Orthodox LGBTQ people to take off their kippah, right? Because they're kind of a threat from within. Rabbis calling them terrorists, worse than, I can't remember if they said Hamas or Hezbollah, but as in this time, it's particularly chilling. They've been quiet in the past few weeks. We have, but everyone is waiting for them to start spewing gems. Anyway, so what these conservative rabbis or conservative Orthodox are fearful of is the encroachment of secularism, of modern Western thought. Postmodernism, for some reason, like all these rabbis who I assure you have not read a word, right, of any postmodern scholar, but like postmodernism has become this this boogeyman that they keep talking about, and they feel that LGBTQ identities and lives and visibility and presence within their communities at the Shabbat table in the synagogue, right, represents the corruption, right, the corruption of all these ill dynamics of Western society. So they have come to represent, and especially, right, and their ire is especially taken out basically on their own, right, on their people from their own communities. So not on secular. And every year around Pride Parade, so Jerusalem Pride Parade is, I mean, it's like, I just looked at the politics of the mundane. I mean, it's like a cutesy kind of thing, right? It's not your typical Pride Parade. It's like families with strollers, and every once in a while there's like someone with like a wild pink, whatever, fishnet. And every year, like, you can expect some kind of rabbi to give them free publicity, to give the sort of, with some, dire remarks about the parade and how it corrupts, the young and the soul of Judaism, basically.
Thank you. So I imagine that one question that people might, the audience be thinking at this point then is, given the feelings of some Orthodox conservatives, and then there's a whole spectrum. So that's on the one end, but resistance along a whole spectrum, maybe from some Orthodox leaders, from the people that you spent years talking to and observing. Why would you say that they want to remain within Orthodoxy? Like, so in New York, we can imagine lots of queer Jewish possibilities. And so why stay? Why not just find a different avenue to be queer and Jewish?
Yeah, I have a great quote in the book, which I'm not going to find now. I mean, let's conservative, large C, right? Capital C, conservative domination, reform Judaism are very, very small in Israel, but they exist, right? And as in the US, I mean, these denominations are accepting and affirming, especially reform. Remaining was precisely it, right? And they would say, if I leave, that's what they want me to do, right? That's what they want me to do, but then they win, right? Then they get to articulate. They get to define orthodoxy, right? That was this big aha moment when people started to find each other in the early to mid 2000s. They're like, wait, like, why does Rabbi Aviner or why does like the rabbi of my yeshiva get to define who is an Orthodox Jew? Like, I'm an Orthodox Jew as well, right? This is what I believe in. These are my practices. And I guess that and again, that is threatening, right? Change is threatening. Change from within is doubly threatening. And definitely in the early years, it was, and again, not unlike what we see in other movements, right? It was the gay men who kind of led the way, but in part because many of them were highly educated, graduates of or still students at very, very prestigious yeshivas. They spoke the language. They knew they could converse with the rabbis and with sort of educated elites in their own language, right? So they could hold that conversation. And they were visible to them, right?
Thank you. So then staying with that and with religion, and one of the things that comes through clearly in your book is how many of the people that you studied, religion, not just, but it becomes, I'll quote something you wrote. Religion among the people you met is, quote, not only an obstacle to overcome, but also a source of knowledge, empowerment, and self-understanding. So how did you see religion becoming a mechanism, a tool for LGBT Orthodox Jews to have a better sense of themselves?
So that was an aha moment, which took many years for me to arrive at. People would talk about their journeys, right? But it wasn't their queer journeys, let's call them, were always interwoven with theological journeys, with spiritual journeys, right? So the path to understanding oneself. Well, I went back to the books, right? I went back, right? It's like so a woman, told me that she, she began questioning, right, her position or her position vis-a-vis her faith, because she realized she was same sex, attracted, and what was she going to do? She said, well, I did what we learned to do in the midrasha, that sort of the women's equivalent to the yeshiva. She said, I opened the books and I studied, right? So that's a very Jewish way of arriving at that. When people talked about marriage ceremonies, right? That's always a big example. Well, Jewish weddings are very, very gendered affairs, right? So what do you keep? What do you change? How do you change, right? And Hebrew is a very gendered language. So how do you retain the heart, the core of these practices, right? While also making it meaningful to you. So another example, one man said that was someone who's a very, very central activist, talked about tikkun olam, right? Repairing the world, which is a very, very central Jewish tenet. You are supposed to, in your practice, in your life, in your Jewish ethics, to be repairing the world. And he said, well, most people can do their tikkun olam by having children. This being the mid to late 2010s, he could not imagine having a child. He realized that he was gay and that he was not going to marry a woman, which many people still did. He said, there's no way for me to practice this. But then he said, wait, no, I am going to practice this by being an out, visible, gay, Orthodox activist. I am going to go to the parade with my kippah on. That is my tikkun olam, right? That is my world repair, bringing this together, helping others. So it's, you could see it as a form of appropriation or resistance. But to me, it was a story of like building up from within, not, davka, not on purpose, not like in your face, but really in the most kind of Jewish way.
So staying with that, I think, gender is regulated for all of us, but it seems particularly visible in Orthodox communities. And then, so what you've just described, maybe marriage ceremonies, straight Orthodox couples have various regulations within their lives. I'm wondering if you can talk about then how same-sex Orthodox couples are navigating some of the expectations that other married couples would do, what they're innovating, ways that they're sort of queering Orthodoxy in their homes and lives.
So again, it's the politics of the mundane, right? If you have two men, who's going to light the candles, right? Who is going to do Havdalah, right? I mean, there are a lot of, there's sort of two moms, who is going to help prepare the child for, bar mitzvah, who's gonna hold the child or sort of accompany the child for various ceremonies, right? So each like step becomes important, but also, right, sort of a point of creation. Jewish law, or for heterosexual observant couples, the regulation surrounding menstrual purity is massive part of their lives, and that was my dissertation, so I know a whole lot about it. I'm not going to get into it, but just sort of it's a very, very regulated regime that controls, for people who observe it, intimate lives, bodies, and the rhythm of everyday life. Many Orthodox women, sort of modern Orthodox women, they absolutely hate this religious realm, this sort of ritual realm. But because it is so central to Orthodox identity, they kind of grapple with it. For Orthodox lesbians, this became a battleground to claim it, right? Right, and they would, and I spoke with several individuals or couples, right, who said that they went to rabbis and asked them to adapt the halacha, right, the regulations to women, because for them that was a way of feeling accepted, right, that they were not just accepted, seen, right, seen by the halacha. That was when I talked about Rabbi Lau's kind of theological guidelines. They were important because Jews, when they don't know what to do, they look at the halacha or they go to a rabbi, right? If you don't have regulations, right? If there's no law that applies to you, you're invisible, right? So in a crazy way, for some people, that became a way. For others, they were like, you know what, great, I don't have to deal with this realm, like, goodbye. And both of those sort of responses exist within the community.
So someone who was supposed to be here with us tonight was my colleague from NYU, Ann Pellegrini, who is sends her regrets that she can't be here. I was thinking about her co-authored book that she wrote with Janet Jacobson called Love the Sin that came out 20 years ago, 2003. And they have a chapter in this book. It's a great book, Love the Sin. They have a chapter called Born That Way. And they are critiquing how LGBT activists in the 1990s and early 2000s were putting all their weight behind this idea that people are born with particular sexualities and therefore they should be treated equally because they can't help it. And they had many critiques of this, one of which was sort of like an apology, like I would be straight if I could. And it also eclipses, overlooks everyone who, might say, well, today I'm attracted to this population, but let me tell you, last month it was very different. So where do they fit within this argument? So then to read your book, 2023, 20 years later, the LGBT activists who you meet largely, they've got all their weight in the, I'm born this way argument as a strategy. So how effective is the born this way argument in Orthodox Israeli society? And then how do the activists respond to other queers who say, I have more of a fluid sense of gender or sexuality?
Okay, so many thoughts. This may go in too many directions. So yeah, totally. I mean, but it's not born this way. God made me this way, right? It's no, but right. It's the Orthodox, right? It's the religious version of and it's a strategy, but it's also goes back to what you asked me earlier, right? It's also that is a real Jewish response, right? God made me this way, and therefore, right? There's one place where I quote a mother and says, well, God creates all his creatures, and this is how God created my son, and therefore that's just the way it is. So yes, it's a strategy, but it's also a genuine, authentic, Jewish, could be other religions, but in this context, Jewish way of thinking about it. So two things about this. I actually taught the book yesterday, or parts of the book, to my students in gender sexuality class. And they read the chapters about chapters 2 and 3, sort of one of them talks about what I said, the dark side of the tale, the sadness, the shattered dreams, the broken everything. And then the next chapter then kind of builds it up and talks about how they build livable lives. And the students kind of in their responses kept saying, oh, this is so sad. This is so sad. This is so sad, that they feel that they can't just be who they are and live their identity. And they have to say, they resort to this, God made me this way. But like, no, it's not sad. It's like, it's the real Jewish response. So another, in one conference I attended, in like a big Jewish settlement, there were like 300 people in the room. And the event was a weird kind of debate style almost between a very central out gay man activist, God made me this way kind of person, and Orthodox therapist who opposed conversion therapy. And then an ex-gay man, and look how successful he's been because here are his wife and daughter. And a therapist who supports not conversion therapy, but working with people who are struggling, right? These are all code. But what I understood listening to this very odd debate was that the conservative side, right, supports what we would call a socially constructed theory of sexuality, right? It is fluid, it can change. The activists were mostly invested in a more like, God made me this way. So, and this is part of the reason my book focused on gays and lesbian mostly because that was sort of, I realized that I had to tell kind of the origin story of the movement. And that was, but when I entered the field in 2016, there were very, very few, non-binary, queer identifying. There were trans people, but very, very few people were out. That all changed within like 5 years. I think if I started later and finished the book a little later, maybe I would have used different terminology. That's how quickly it changed. But the God made me this way was what allowed rabbis to get on board. And their support was phenomenally important, especially to help bring family members and to soothe their concerns. So, as I said, it's a strategy, but it's also very authentic.
So there's another strategy there's a scene in the book that stood out to me because it was a little less expected for me than thinking this way. And so I'm wondering if you'll share the story with the audience. There's an activist, an LGBT activist who knows a decision is coming down from a rabbi who about Orthodox Jews, and he's concerned about what the decision is going to say, so he decides to take the rabbi out for a night of cruising. So cruising meaning often male-identified people who are in search of anonymous sex with other men, regardless of how they identify. So, for what purpose would just take an Orthodox rabbi out for a night of cruising? And what does that sort of tell you about the strategies they're using and what they ultimately want?
So this is in 2016, sadly, like a month before I arrived. Let's say like a progressive Orthodox organization wrote the first, not halakhic paper per se, so not so much Jewish legal paper, but kind of a policy paper, which is weird because rabbis don't issue policy papers, but they didn't want to call it a halakhic paper. Anyway, that's sort of intra-communal politics. About accept, basically saying to Orthodox Jewish communities, you must accept. They only wrote about gays and lesbians, but the way it was received and perceived sort of widely was about LGBTQ people in general. But this was a paper basically telling Jewish communities it is your Jewish duty to accept gays and lesbians in the midst. And what was interesting about this policy paper was that normally it was written by this group of progressive rabbis, which included women, who are still not really recognized in Israel. So a very progressive group. Behind the scenes, they were consulting with the proud religious community, in particular with several of the men, right? Because they were the learned ones, etc. And one of the things that they were going to write, like that, they were not going to make a distinction between basically one night stands and long-term monogamous relationship from a halakhic, right? From a Jewish legal perspective. And the activists were very, very alarmed by this and other decisions. And one of the activists tells this story. He told me this privately, but he also told this sort of on stage at a conference when this sort of policy paper was launched, that he sat down with these rabbis who listened to him, right? Who consulted, asked for his advice. He said, you can't write about our lives when you don't understand them. You don't understand our lives. You don't know what it means. So he said, so that's when he invited him for a night of cruising. It didn't actually happen, right? It didn't actually happen. Like later, when I write about it, I write about it as it unfolds because he leaves it kind of as a gray area. It was very gratifying as a photographer, right? You can't write about people's lives if you don't understand them. But that was an important moment, right? Because they earned a seat at the table. This very like a first principle of activism, right? You don't talk about us without us, or don't do, right? They achieved that. And this is 2016. The first organizations are incorporated in 2005, 2006, 2007. So very quickly.
Was the cruising to show like we're not that, that's not what we want marriages, or was it to show like look what happens when everything's a secret and
Yeah.
stigmatized?
Yes,
that-
yes. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
where you're, sorry. Went off track.
There's so
Yeah.
many possibilities of cruising that you just don't know. So you had mentioned before this, you had written the book a little bit later and done research that the makeup of it would have maybe not been primarily cisgender men and lesbians. Can you say a bit more about sort of where you see the place, if you have insights of where things are going with more trans, queer, non-binary people, if you feel like they'll be left behind, if the strategies will change, where do you see that?
So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, like I don't know what I would have done because part of the issue is, again, there's the history, right? And there's also the theology, right? And the sort of the halachic, right? The halachic Jewish legal issues pertaining to same-sex love, right? And trans issues and non-binary are very different, right? So I don't know, maybe it would have been different chapters. I don't know. But what I can say is like 2016, when I came into the field, there were 3 men's organizations and 1 women's organization, right? A couple were more conservative. One was more kind of a more progressive. That's actually the one that won the day. There had been attempts to start a trans Orthodox organization. There were just not enough people. And again, the queer, non-binary were like not part of the language. In short order, both the women's organization, so the lesbian Orthodox organization and the men's organization started, like, I think it was like a 5-year battle to change their mission statement and to change their names, right, to be inclusive of trans and non-binary. I am forgetting now. I think it was 2021 for the women's organization, 2022 for the men's, or maybe, but the point is that they talk about themselves in much broader and more inclusive terms. The main activists are still cisgender, highly educated, gays and lesbians, right? I mean, that's the reality.
So I want to ask one more question, then we'll open up to all of you for your questions. You had mentioned in your opening remarks some connections between things that you've observed about LGBT Orthodox activists and then thinking through their thoughts, their positions on Palestinians. So you say in the book that many of the people that you interacted with, the LGBT Orthodox Jews, subscribe to like right of center nationalist visions. I feel like I remember a story where there was someone who lived in a settlement and was upset that their pride flag was ripped down, but that didn't necessarily produce a sense of like shared marginalization with Palestinians. So can you talk a bit about LGBT Orthodox Jews vis-a-vis then issues surrounding Palestinians and their marginalization?
The short answer is like no. Like I mean, so you come in to the field having read in the, on social activism and about LGBT or, queer activism. So you have certain expectations, right? And you come from New York where intersectionality, right? It's like you don't even have to explain it in the classroom anymore. And for the most part, that was just not part of the conversation. And I'm looking at Carl, my friend and colleague Carl here, because he pushed me on it and other people pushed me on it. And it took me a long time to articulate what to do with that, because the people I worked with articulated a very, call it progressive, right? But very informed critique of oppressive social structures and of domination and of systems of power. And yet, for the most part, that did not apply to the intra-religious and the nationalist question. And there were many instances where this, and by the way, this is also true not of just Orthodox LGBTQ. This is true of, there's been a rightward shift in queer movements in Israel in general. Not to the same extent. And again, their claim to belonging was, we are of you, right? So the religious Zionist nationalism is written into this, what it means to be part of this community. In, I can't remember now, one of the election cycles in 2021, there were so many of them. That was the first time that a member of this transphobic, homophobic party, I mean, that was their claim to fame was like that was their platform, anti-LGBTQ. So this party comes on the scene and it is like immediately ridiculed because it was so extreme and so bizarre. You know, the short of it is that their person gets elected. I can't remember, in one of the election cycles, and is now a deputy minister several cycles later. That was the moment where people started to realize, because this party was not only transphobic and homophobic, but like, you know, wearing it on their sleeve, but also ultra nationalist and xenophobic and all the rest of it. That was a moment where people said, oh, like they were starting to really make the connections. And I was seeing before October 7th, I was seeing some, like within the community, because I you know, I still follow people and I communicate with some people, with the protest movement, that there were maybe nascent kind of understandings of these connections, but whatever. I mean, that's all gone now.
Thank you. So we want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. So now's the time for any questions you'd like to pose. Oh, so and then
It's not really a question. I just wanted to say I had been the liberal marching prior to October 7th. A lot of the people that were marching for the democracy were not at all interested in having the people that were concerned about the Palestinians showing up. So, and they marched by themselves. So it seems to be, what you said, not just for gays and lesbians.
Yeah, no, the protest movement. Yeah, I mean, you know, there seemed to be a kernel of possibility there.
You know, I thank you for your talk. It's an upbeat, for all the problems you discussed, it's an upbeat message to have right now.
Thank you. It's hard to be.
I know it is, but I couldn't help thinking of our own modern Orthodox community in New York, and Yeshiva University is a kind of center for it. And I know the faculty and students there have many contacts with Israel and are often traveling there. And they lately were in the news because the administration shut down an effort by LGBT students to have their own group. And I don't even know how that has played out in the courts now. But I wondered if the people you studied in Israel, is there any inspiration to be taken from modern Orthodoxy in the US, or is it just another world?
Well, first of all, the Yeshiva University case is still making its way through the courts. I'm actually following it very closely. I think it's going to end up being a blockbuster Supreme Court case. That's gonna, of religious freedom supporting the university. That's my prediction. But you know, it's really interesting. I didn't realize this because I was so focused on the local context. And then when I kind of started talking to people here, and you know, Rabbi Steve Greenberg from Eshel, that is the dominant or one of the dominant organizations, Orthodox LGBTQ organizations in the US, I realized that in a way, sort of the Israeli movement had kind of pulled ahead, in part because it's so small and and incestuous, not incestuous, but it's just close knit, right? I mean, this person from the yeshiva and large families, and they married this one, and they're neighbors with this other one. So there's a lot of connections that I think sort of facilitated a shift and forced a shift because people live close to their families. They want to be able to go home. People kind of communicate with a rabbi. So in a weird way, I think that some of the progress made in Israel could actually sort of find its way here. On the other hand, here there are more shades of Orthodoxy, right? There are more possibilities.
Thank you.
I have two, hopefully they'll be. First of all, I'm wondering, your book is on my shelf, but I haven't read it yet. What connections, if there are any, between the religious organizations that you talk about, and secular queer organizations in Israel? And also you mentioned about sort of the basically the queer Orthodox Jews, you said, like, basically kind of want to be like traditionally Orthodox, and fit into this sort of like Mafdal profile. Like they just want to be like nationalist religious. But do they have any critique of, say, at least the men, of like masculinity or at all from a queer perspective? Because
Totally. Right.
Okay.
So I'll start with the second. Yeah,
Sure.
I mean, totally they have a critique. And I mean, even in self-presentation, like you go to Bat Kol, that's the lesbian now queer women's organization events. And I mean, in terms of self-presentation, you're gonna see from whatever, pants, shirt, all the way to hair covering and long skirts and modest. So there's a total sort of critique, but there's also, so let me give you one example. So one of the early community initiatives was the making of a queer synagogue in Israel, in Tel Aviv, right? Center Tel Aviv, which is like the secular capital, right? LGBTQ center would host high holiday prayers. And so it's significant because this is happening in sort of Tel Aviv, I mean, right, highly secular, not secular, anti-religious, okay? In the gayborhood, right, in Tel Aviv. So 2009, activists start this sort of basically gay synagogue there for the high holidays because they were thrown out of their sort of, but not really accepting one. They had a men's section, they had a women's section, and they had, come all section. And to me, right, so that's one of the productive, right? And then I attended a couple of years. I mean, you saw everything from people dressed in like traditional, or kind of clothes to like people in flip flops, right? And that was all accepted. That was all accepted. In terms of the relationship between the proud religious community and secular organizations, they had to fight for their seat at the table. And there is actually a pretty organized kind of infrastructure. There are like dozens of organizations. And it took several years, but they're a part of it. And what they said, we're always educating them, right? So like, if you're gonna have a protest on Saturday, don't start it before Shabbat ends. Like 1 year, there was a huge protest because Israel had these sort of surrogacy laws, but they excluded same-sex couples. So they excluded sort of gay couples. There was a huge protest. Well, it was Tisha B'Av. So, right? So they came, right? They came. But you know, still fasting and everything. So part of their activism is to be visible not in Orthodox spaces, but also in queer spaces as Orthodox people. I'll hand it to you, but no, that's not what you understand to say.
We have time for maybe one more question if there's.
So, thank you so much. This was a really rich conversation. It feels like there is a part 2 to be written, and you've given us a little bit of glimmers of what that might look like. And I love the idea of politics of the mundane and the boring. And thank you for coming and for asking questions, and also just for teaching us and being in conversation about both hopeful things and also hard things. And I hope that we can continue having those conversations together as a community, and that you'll come back for our other conversations and events as well. So thank you.